Robots Radio presents...
In 1999, director Brad Bird gave the world a Cold War commentary paired with a giant robot.
In 2020, we kick off spring with a bottom-shelf Canadian whiskey.
The film is The Iron Giant.
The whiskey is Canadian Mist.
And we'll review them both. This is
The Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we're looking at the 1999 animated classic, The Iron Giant. And we are joined today in studio by one of our all-time favorite people and frequent guest host, Jordan McCain. Jordan, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing good. How's it going, Film and Whiskey Nation? You guys need a term for your fans. What do you call? Is that what you call them?
That is what we call them. There is a whole.
I was thinking.
There's a whole nation of us. We are pursuing becoming a sovereign entity.
I was thinking like a noun of like what you call the individuals, like foo-woos or something really terrible. When you do your live podcast someday,
right? Exactly.
In front of a huge crowd, you're like, "What up, foo-woos?"
All right. Well, we've now learned that we can just discard anything Jordan says over the course of this podcast. So cool.
Foo-woos. Oh, Bob, I am on board for this.
Of course you are. All right. So today we're checking out The Iron Giant. This is a movie that just celebrated its 20th anniversary. And Brad, if I'm not mistaken, this is like the third, fourth, fifth movie we've done from 1999. What a fantastic year for movies it was.
Yeah, it really got dragged down by this film.
Ugh. Brad, are you kidding me, Brad?
I mean, no, I'm slightly kidding. This is a fine, decent piece of animation. I really enjoy certain parts of it. But overall, you know, it's just kind of another animated film.
Oh my gosh, dude. Okay. Well, I hope Jordan likes this movie because I'm ready to go hard on this one. I love The Iron Giant. I think this movie is phenomenal. I think that it is an underrated cartoon classic. And I will fight you on this, Brad.
Yeah, I would have to say I also agree with you, Bob, that I have fond memories of this movie as a kid. It was fun to look back at it as an adult. I've seen it quite a few times and see how poorly it did in the box office, which made me laugh.
Yeah.
But the themes that have continued with the film have really stuck with me. And it seemed like a really good contemporary critique of our modern times being set in the Cold War. I love Cold War movies. I love animated movies. I think Brad Bird, so smart. Great guy.
He's a good guy. Thanks, Brad. All right, so before we get into talking about this movie, I have to ask, Brad, was this the first time you've seen The Iron Giant?
Yeah, amazingly enough, having grown up in the 90s, like 99, I was 9 years old. I should have seen this movie, but I've never seen it, even to this day. I just haven't watched it.
So I'm actually in the same spot you are, Brad, because this movie, like Jordan said, it came out, it did not do great at the box office. It was considered a flop. Warner Animation was not really a huge animation studio, and certainly having this movie bomb at the box office did not help. But then almost immediately after it flopped at the box office, it started getting kind of a cult following. Critics were saying that it was a movie that people had kind of missed the bandwagon on, that they should check it out again. I think Cartoon Network bought the rights to show this on TV, and once they got the rights to it, they showed it all the time. And I remember seeing it for the first time on Cartoon Network, and so it had a ton of commercial breaks. But every time they came back from commercial break, there was an announcer that said, "We now return to the animated classic, The Iron Giant." And I was like, oh, an animated classic? And I'll tell you what, like watching it as a 10, 12-year-old, this movie just absolutely captivated me because I think that it portrayed childhood in a different way than what I was seeing in Disney movies. It's a much more sort of adult movie in terms of its themes. It deals with life and death. It deals with the things that kids were going through in the Cold War. You know, I think that they have a really sort of clever way of working in nuclear holocaust into like the plot of this movie. But I was just captivated by it. And it sounds like Jordan was too. And Brad, seeing this movie now at almost 30 years old, it seems like this movie just did not capture your imagination the way it did with us.
Yeah, see, here's the thing, Bob. there's certain things about this movie that I really enjoyed. Like at the start of the movie, when they show the video of the kid sitting at the desk and, they're like, oh, if a nuclear bomb hits, hide under your desk with your hands over your head. And like they literally have a video of the entire world around them as this giant crater. And they're still safe smiling under their desk.
Right.
I don't remember if they do it or not, but the kid's pretty much like giving a thumbs up like, hey, I'm good to go. Nuclear fallout can't hurt me. So like there's certain parts of this movie that I genuinely enjoy, that are funny, that are whimsical, that are interesting. I thought the animation style was really beautiful. It honestly was reminiscent of like Beauty and the Beast for me. Mm-hmm. There's times where my wife and I were watching this and she goes, oh, I feel like when she was looking at Jennifer Aniston's character, she's like, I feel like I'm looking at Belle from Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah.
So like, I think the animation style was beautiful. I think the voice acting was really great. I thought Eli Marienthal killed it as Hogarth Hughes. I mean, he just did a spectacular job. I thought Harry Connick Jr. was decent. He was a little bit over the top, but like, there are things that I like about this movie.
Well, that's good news. And before we get into Brad Explains, which is our favorite segment on the show, I do want to say that I'm with you on some of this, Brad. I think that you can see the influences, the movies that influenced this movie all over the place. And Beauty and the Beast was the first one I wrote down because you get that opening with the guy kind of shipwrecking into the Iron Giant. And then you get a fade out and it fades back in on this, sunny, pleasant New England town. And even the music cues are like, you think they're going to go into the opening song from Beauty and the Beast. It was like very shamelessly ripping off Beauty and the Beast in those early moments. But I think, this movie owes such a debt to E.T. I mean, obviously, it's an alien that comes down, a boy, takes care of him. The government wants to take it away. It's essentially E.T. set during the Cold War.
Yeah, literally Haley, like a quarter of the way into the movie, she goes, oh, we're just watching E.T. again, aren't we?
Yeah, and I think that's probably the biggest criticism of the movie that I can give is that the plot is familiar. And I mean, you can see influences at the end of the film. I saw a lot of King Kong, with people trying to shoot down this thing that they saw as a giant monster. There's a scene that reminds me of Treasure of the Sierra Madre, where the government agent and the boy are having like a stare down of who's going to fall asleep first. There's a lot of War of the Worlds, the old War of the Worlds from the 50s when the Iron Giant kind of turns into this killing machine for a little bit. And so you can definitely see the influences on Brad Bird as he makes this film. And I think we're going to get into talking about some of that. But before we do, it's time for our favorite segment, which is called Brad Explains. Now, if you're new to the podcast, what this segment is Brad breaks down the plot of a movie that in many instances he's seeing for the first time, and we're lucky enough to get him catching this movie for the first time. So, Brad, can you explain to us the plot of the film, The Iron Giant?
Man, I don't know if I'm up to it, Bob. That's a hardy task.
We'll just copy and paste your breakdown from E.T. and we'll be good.
Oh, all right. Well, then let's move on. So the movie The Iron Giant is about a young boy named Hogarth Hughes. His mother is a waitress at a local diner. Dad's not in the picture, a la Pixar. He is just kind of living his life. I think that the movie is set in like the late 50s to the early 60s. He's this cute kid who enjoys being out in the woods in their New England town. And eventually he is out and about and he finds this iron giant that has crashed through the sky from unknown reaches of outer space. It has come ashore and it eats metal. And it attempts to eat a giant power converter station and it electrocutes the heck out of him. And Hogarth turns off the power station by magically finding the giant on-off switch, turning everything off and saving the Iron Giant. And from there, a friendship is formed. He begins to hang out with the Iron Giant. He eventually finds a way to feed him at a local scrapyard. And so the movie is about how he's kind of trying to keep him hidden so that the government and the town doesn't find out about him. But of course, this fails. And at some point, the government comes to destroy the Iron Giant. It's in the middle of the Cold War. It's extremely fearful of enemy technology coming to destroy their nation. And so they move to attack it. And lo and behold, their worst fears come true. The Iron Giant is a technological terror. You know, he is destroying the town. He's acting in aggression towards the military. And it takes a heroic sacrifice of Hogarth to stand in front of the guns, and he eventually stops the Iron Giant. But the military has launched a nuclear missile to destroy the Iron Giant, and the Iron Giant takes off into the sky, flies into space, and sacrifices himself in order to save the New England town and the young boy that he cares for, Hogarth.
And that is the Iron Giant. So, Brad, I know that you probably want to get into talking about what it is that you didn't like about this movie, but I think we should focus the first half of our conversation on things that we did like. You've already kind of mentioned that you really, really enjoyed Eli Marienthal as Hogarth Hughes. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was one of my honorable mentions in our top 5 voice actor performance episode. I think that he is just phenomenal. And there's something about that sort of like gravelly voice he has, even as a kid, where he does the disinterested thing very well, but he also plays the emotion very well. When he, at the end of the film, when the Iron Giant's going to sacrifice himself and he says, "I love you." And there's just this ache in his voice that you don't get with a lot of child actors. I really thought he knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, I totally agree, Bob. He honestly reminded me of like if Nemo from Finding Nemo was like 13 years old, you would have Eli Marienthal. Like, he does such an impressive job. He has such a sweetness to his voice. He's so kind and caring. And I just feel like he really gets the part of Hogarth, this kind of free-spirited, excited youth that just can't wait to see what the world has to offer. And lo and behold, the world has to offer him a Iron Giant. And he just has so much enthusiasm and sincerity in his performance. I really, truly enjoyed him.
No, I thought he did a really good job as well. I think as we've seen the evolution of child actors and even child voice actors and adults playing children or whatever, I'm genuinely surprised when you find a child who seems to just do a really, really good job in some of these scenarios, because it can seem a little strange or stale or awkward when you have them. And I've seen some movies recently that reminded me of that, but he just kills it.
Jordan, I'm curious, as someone who likes this movie a lot, who else in the cast do you really appreciate their voice acting performance?
Yeah. One of my favorite hobbies when I watch films is to go onto the IMDb trivia and see who almost played a lot of these roles. And I love Christopher McDonald as Kent Mansley. He, throughout his career, has been like the expert of very small roles. I've loved him as, I forgot that he was Shooter McGavin in Happy Gilmore, which is just such a funny role to think about it. But, the people who almost were Kent Mansley was like Arnold Schwarzenegger for one, and Burt Reynolds for another, which would have really changed, I think, the tone of the film. But for whatever reason, this small time kind of actor guy really killed it, portraying an agent, a government agent who's just really trying to prove himself and is really desperate all the time to do a good job. It just is very convincing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I was going to bring him up if you weren't, because I think aside from Eli Marienthal, he was my favorite performance in the movie. He comes in as this guy that is just so clearly larger than life. And we use this term all the time on the podcast, but chewing scenery left and right. But he has such a good bad guy voice. And, immediately I'm like, I recognize that voice from somewhere. So I did exactly what you did, went on IMDb, and I'm like, oh, it's the Happy Gilmore guy. And I just like, from that point on, I was just like enthralled by his performance. I thought it was so, so good. But I'm wondering, Brad, you kind of talked about Harry Connick Jr. a little bit. I'm wondering what you thought of Jennifer Aniston in this movie. Because I think a lot of her character is just kind of wandering around going, Hogarth, where are you? And to be honest, like, I can't tell if I just didn't care for the character, if it was just an underdeveloped character, or if I just don't really think that Jennifer Aniston is that good of a voice actor. Because even in those early scenes with Hogarth's mom, she's kind of, I don't know, it seems like she's just kind of dialing it in a little bit with her performance, and you don't really get the vibe of like, I am an overworked, exhausted mother from her performance. I think the script keeps telling us that, but she kind of just sounds like Rachel from Friends walking into the room and being like, oh, Hogarth, I'm really tired. And I just, it didn't work for me. I don't know. What did you guys think of her performance?
Well, see, my struggle with Jennifer Aniston, and I think this isn't a new commentary, is that she is always Rachel from Friends. That she always kind of just has that kind of sickly sweet persona of Jennifer Aniston. I don't know. That's the problem with her, but it's also the charm of her. And honestly, I agree with you that her character was underdeveloped and it just seemed like she'd played a very minimalistic role in this movie. But I actually really like Jennifer Aniston as a voice actor. She has such a sweetness to her voice that when you don't have to see her physically acting, the voice really comes through strongly, and I actually really enjoy her. For me, it was interesting because the other role in which she's an overworked waitress that I can think of her in is in the movie Office Space. And I think actually in that movie, she plays a better version of tired of the world, annoyed with the world, Rachel from Friends, rather than this one where it does kind of feel like she is a cartoon. She's always kind of hopeful and she's always looking ahead at the beautiful horizon. And she just kind of has this, I don't know, I don't want to call it sickly sweet, but it's kind of a really sweet performance that fits Jennifer Aniston really well.
Yeah, ironically, Brad, she also plays a overworked waitress in the first many seasons of Friends as well. So I think that's kind of, maybe that's her niche. Maybe that's what she was going
that's
for.
Her niche.
I think it's hard to tell.
She's just flipping through scripts in the late 90s like, come on, waitress.
I honestly think it's hard to tell with animated features. She definitely didn't do anything wrong that broke the immersion of being in a cartoon. But in some ways, you have to wonder when you're not tapped on the shoulder again to do some animated features. Maybe she just kept saying no. I don't know if she was offered all kinds of roles. But I would agree that there was certainly nothing extraordinary about her take on the character.
Yeah, for sure. All right, before we go to our break, I want to talk about kind of the structure of the movie, the script of the movie.
Bob, we haven't talked about Vin Diesel as the Iron Giant.
I'll tell you what, if you put Vin Diesel as Iron Giant up against Vin Diesel as Groot, who wins that fight? Because he probably says more words as the Iron Giant, but is he more emotionally resonant as Groot?
He says 54 words as the Iron Giant.
54 words? I love that Jordan's just in the background shouting out that information.
Yeah, he says
I looked it up,
54
54 words.
54 different words as the Iron Giant. I don't think he says that many as Groot. My money's on the Iron Giant.
All right, wait, was that a joke? Because I'm pretty sure he says 3 words as Groot.
He says he says
I am Groot.
He says 4 words as Groot. He says I am Groot many, many times, and then
he says we are Groot.
He says we are Groot.
All right. So he says 50 more words as the Iron Giant.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about, but Vin Diesel has perfected the large, mostly silent character.
See this? This is called a rock. Rock. Good. Yes. No. That is a tree. Rock. Tree. Get it? That's right.
I would like to hear if you added up, all 58 words that he has said as the Iron Giant and Groot over the years, compared to the paychecks he got for all those movies. And just, we counted out how many dollars per word this man gets as a voice actor.
See, now
it's got to be in the millions at this point.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, I'm not sure that Vin Diesel actually knows many more than 58 words.
I was going to say, I don't know what the word count for the Fast and Furious movies is when he does Dominic Toretto, but I can't imagine it's many more than 54 words.
It's pretty much the same thing as Groot, because he, instead of saying we are Groot, he just says we are family.
Yep.
That's all he says.
Yep. As someone who has never seen the Fast and Furious movies, I'll take your word for it. I believe that those are the things he says.
Brad, what we're actually doing is we're going to hold out until there are 32 Fast and Furious movies, and then we'll just do a whole season of the podcast on them. All right, so before we get to our break, I do want to talk about Brad Bird as a director, and helping with the screenplay of this movie. One thing that really stuck out to me about this film is it is an hour and 27 minutes, including closing credits. It is a very short film. And I think that for parts of the movie, the efficiency of the film really, really works. This thing moves like gangbusters. And I actually was really impressed in the early scenes. You could kind of tell that they were trying to move it along and not have any fat on this thing. I remember when Hogarth first gets home from kind of messing up the diner and he's watching a scary movie on TV, and then the TV goes out. He says, "Stupid antenna." And then it immediately cuts to him opening a window in a different part of the house. You don't see him go up the stairs. You don't see him go, find his flashlight. It's like, we don't need to see any of that stuff. You get the line that introduces the next scene, and then it's an immediate cut to the next scene. And I really loved how efficient and lean this movie is in the early going. But I also think that keeping the movie so short kind of undermined a lot of the emotional moments. When Dean, Harry Connick Jr.'s character, is protecting Hogarth from the giant when it kind of snaps into that defense mechanism and tries to kill him, Hogarth runs away and he's like, "Hogarth, no, come back." And then he immediately sees Hogarth's gun on the ground, toy gun. And he has this profound realization, but it happens in the course of like 3 seconds where he's like, it was a defense mechanism. He was reacting to the gun. And then it cuts to Dean rescuing Hogarth on a motorcycle. And it's like your character just had a major shift in attitude towards the Iron Giant. And you did that whole shift in about 3.5 seconds. And I think sometimes those moments don't get quite the time they need to have like an emotional resonance.
Yeah, I really struggle with certain aspects of Brad Bird's filmmaking, and yet there's certain moments where he uses like camera angles and he pans the camera in a way that mimics, live action filmography so well. He captures characters' emotions extremely well with his camera movement in this movie. But I would agree, there's a few moments where you're like, man, Brad, like you only went on this for like an hour and 25 minutes. You probably could have given an extra 10 minutes to maybe flesh out a few of the scenes a little bit more deeply.
I was wondering about the runtime, and I've recently become an avid user of Disney Plus because all 30-some seasons of The Simpsons are on there. And I had a moment of realization that I kept seeing Brad Bird's name in the credits for The Simpsons. I'd totally forgotten that he started a lot of his career on writing, producing, and directing some of the best seasons of the really iconic TV show. And I was wondering what it would be like to try to transition from that. And really his next big project was The Iron Giant. I wonder how a tight 22-minute TV show that is a cartoon influenced his ability to make like a feature-length film.
Jordan, I think that's a really good point. And when we get back from our break, I think we should talk about some of the flaws with this movie, because I don't think it's a flawless film. Brad clearly doesn't think that. But before we get to that point, let's hit pause. And we're going to start a new segment for the next few weeks on our show called the Spring of Swill, where we're going to be sampling lower shelf whiskeys. The kind of whiskeys that you might take one look at and say, I'm not sure about that. So for the next 7 or so weeks on the podcast, Brad and I are going to be exploring budget whiskeys and telling you whether or not we think they're of any value.
Yes, Bob, and for the first week of our Springtime of Swill, we will be misting some Canadian whiskey into our nose holes.
All right, well, let's get to it, Brad. We're going to try some Canadian Mist. All right, so today we are checking out Canadian Mist. Now, as we said at the top of the episode, we are leaning into springtime with our Springtime of Swill. I'm actually really excited to do the Spring of Swill because, it's a funny little name that we came up with, but I don't think that a lot of these cheaper whiskeys are going to be that bad. And I think part of the reason that we're doing this is to show that you can get fairly decent whiskey for a really, really low price. And Canadian Mist certainly fits the bill. This comes in the plasticiest of all plastic bottles. We got 2 little just shot size samples to try, and they were 99 cents a piece. So, Brad, we have invested $2 whole into drinking this whiskey today.
Man, we got an entire week's worth of recording for $2.
$2.
I'm excited about that.
This is only the second Canadian whiskey we've done on the podcast. Canadian whiskey is not highly regarded around the world. You know, a lot of people just don't view it as a legitimate source of whiskey, but hey, we do. We'll try anything on this podcast. So we're back to the wonderful country of Canada. We're trying this Canadian Mist. This is a blended Canadian whiskey. On the bottle, it says that all of the whiskeys that are in this blend are at least 18 months old. So it's not insanely young, but this is also not nearly as aged as that Canadian Club 12 that we tried in season 1.
Yeah, and I remember enjoying that Canadian Club a little more than I had expected to. So I'm curious to get into this Canadian Mist.
I am too, Brad. I think the thing that I remember about drinking Canadian whiskey is that it tends to just not have a lot of complexity to it. It's pretty straightforward. A lot of times it's a lower proof, so there's just not usually as much going on. I think that's maybe why some whiskey lovers around the world just kind of discount Canadian whiskey. But especially for the price, you know, if it tastes good, I'm going to give this a high score. So let's get into it, Brad. What are you picking up on the nose of this Canadian Mist?
Honestly, as I nose this whiskey, I am getting up hints of gasoline.
Wow. That's actually really surprising. I don't know if it's because we're using different glassware, Brad, but when I poured this out, it is like, I love it. It's overwhelmingly sweet, and you know how I love my sweet whiskeys. I'm getting just like nothing but like Heath Bar, toffee. I couldn't pick it up at first. I was like, is that caramel? No. Is it butterscotch? No. It's like, it's nothing but toffee. And it is like, I think most people would be turned off by this nose because it's like sickeningly sweet coming out of my glass.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that it's not sweet. It's kind of that like, I don't know, like it just reminds me of gasoline in the sense that like it has this kind of strange sweetness to it. And yet I think that I might die if I drink it.
So we've already started off with a glowing review from Brad. I'm not picking up any sort of weird smells on this. It's pretty much just toffee for me, which it's not a very complex nose. It has a very sort of creamy, you know, just Heath Bar kind of scent to it. After a couple minutes, I have picked up a little bit of that sort of scotchy earthiness you get. We even got it on some of the Irish, like on the Redbreast. I have just a hint of that. But Brad, I really, really love this nose. I can tell already that you don't, but I'm going to start us off in a very high spot and give this a 9 on the nose.
What the
Bro, I don't know what you're drinking, but this is completely different on my end.
Wow, Bob, that is a impressively high score to give it. I don't even know if you gave Quinta Rubin a 9 out of 10 on the nose. Like, I think that you might be hinting at your value score already in the way that your nose score is colored. For me, I do notice those earthy notes. I think that's a lot of what I'm picking up. I was about to say that this isn't the worst smelling whiskey I've ever smelt, but I might be lying. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 10.
Oh my gosh.
Actually, since we go in half point increments, I'm going to give it the lowest score I can, a 0.5 out of 10.
I wonder if we just have 2 very different samples of this whiskey, because it can't just be glassware. There has to be something else going on. I really, really love this, Brad, and I'm not picking up any of that sort of gasoline-y smell. So maybe you should just plug your nose as you take a sip, because you're clearly picking up something else.
I might have to.
Let's give this a sip.
Oh, God.
Oh, man.
That's not great on the front.
What happened to your bottle of this whiskey? Did you leave it out in the sun to bake and then, bury it in the snow during the winter? Like, what happened?
I might have. So the front end of the tastes like gasoline. The back end actually isn't too bad. It's somewhat pleasant. I'm getting a little bit of caramely, almost like what you said, a little bit of toffee on the finish. But the opening, like first taste bud that it touches, it tastes like gasoline.
For me, I don't know, like right up front, the flavor is very sweet. It has that very creamy kind of texture that I picked up on the nose. There's a lot of vanilla on this. There's a lot of that toffee on this. I think it's really consistent with what I picked up on the nose of it, I think I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. I really like the flavor. I'm shocked that you're picking up such different notes on this.
Yeah, the front end, like I said, the moment it touches the tip of my tongue, I'm still getting that full blasted nose gasoline. And so it ruins the taste. I'm going to give it a 1.5 on taste. Honestly, it finishes really smooth. I mean, I'm sure that I'm not going to look, but I'm sure that it's an 80 proof whiskey.
It is, yeah.
It finishes really smooth. And that's where a few of those sweeter notes come out. It does kind of taste caramely, toffee-like on the back end. I'm actually going to give it a 7.5 on the finish.
This is we are comically opposite each other today. I have no idea. Are you sure you're drinking Canadian Mist?
Bob, I will say this. With my first 3 scores, I have now reached your first score.
All right, so here's what I'm going to do. Before I give my finished score, I want Film and Whiskey Nation to just commit with us to go to the liquor store and buy a $1 worth size shot of this and let us know what you think, because we have to find what the rest of the world thinks of this, because we are so humorously, comedically far apart on this.
Yeah, Bob, this is ridiculous. I don't know what you're getting on the nose. I can taste it at the end. Like I said, the finish actually isn't that bad. If I didn't have to drink the stuff, if I could just get like the back end of it, I'd be like, yeah, that's a solid 10. I don't even know. Is a fifth of this like $10?
Yeah, it's exactly $10. So
wow. Call me Nostradamus.
I will say that I think the finish is actually the worst part of this. It's real short. It's slightly bitter. It's got kind of a prickly feeling. That's where a little bit of the alcohol comes out for me. But it's not drying. It's refreshing. I just don't think there's really anything to write home about with it. It's less impressive than the nose or the taste for me. I'm going to give it a 6 on the finish. So you actually gave it a higher score on finish than I did. And that takes us to overall balance. Now, this is, in my opinion, a fairly well-balanced whiskey. I think that it's not very complicated, but for the price, it's kind of like, so what? There's a lot of toffee. That toffee note carries through to the taste. It's really, really sweet. I don't get a lot of bitterness on this. I don't know how, I just don't know what Brad's tasting, and I'm sure he has no idea what I'm tasting because we are so vastly far apart on this. But I'm going to give it a 7.5 on the balance.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and give it a 3 on balance. Like, it has something going on at the very end. The nose definitely gives me what the taste ends up being. But yeah, it's not very well balanced. It's just kind of a 3.
And that brings us to overall value. Now, in the state of Ohio, a fifth of Canadian Mist will cost you exactly $9.99. So this is, I believe, the least expensive whiskey we've ever had on this podcast. And I'm not going to lie. I think this is a tremendous value. I think that this would be one of the best $10 you could spend and get a whole fifth of whiskey. Is it a great whiskey? Probably not. Like, if this cost even $20, I think my score would be wildly different. But I was expecting something that was going to make me just want to pour this down the drain. And I did not find that to be the case. I really, really enjoyed the flavor on this. I think if you want to use it for a mixer, you can. But there's just such a rich, kind of creamy, toffee goodness to this that it's worth $10. Brad, I'm going to give this a 9.5 on value.
Yeah. So I will say that, it being the Springtime of Swill, I'm actually kind of okay with giving this a 4.5 on value. Like, it's not a good whiskey. I did not enjoy it. The finish was above average, but outside of that, it was pretty much garbage. So, it's $10 though. Like, I'm not going to put something on this Canadian Mist that shouldn't be there. I'm not going to expect it to be a single barrel select bourbon. It's fine. It's, whatever. I'll give it a 5 on value.
There it is.
There you go. You can have a 5, Canada.
All right, so it's time to reveal our final scores. Brad, I think I've been keeping track of yours correctly, but why don't you hit us with that final score?
I have given Canadian Mist a generous 17.5, which without my finish score would be a 10. So,
all right, are you ready for this?
Dude, now, you gave it like a 40-something.
It was a 40 out of 50, Brad. My final score is a 40. And I will say, again, we really do factor in value. And I gave it a 9.5 on value. But even without that, I thought that this was a fairly good whiskey. And I think maybe for me, I wasn't objectively scoring the categories. I had the $9.99 in mind all through it. So, like, do I think that, you know, the 7.5 on taste is the same as a 7.5 that I would give a $40 bottle of whiskey? Probably not. Like, this is not as good as that. But I was so dreading drinking this, and I was so pleasantly surprised by it that I think I just kind of maybe upped my scores a little bit because I was like, wow, a $10 whiskey tastes this good. That's a 7.5.
It's a testament to how expectations set us up.
So that's bringing us out to a 57.5 out of 100, or a 28.75. So just slightly above the midpoint. I would be really interested to put this up against something like a benchmark from our very first episode, Brad, and see what we think of how this stacks up to another 80 proof sort of bottom shelf whiskey. I don't know. How do you feel about this final score, 28.75?
It's a little bit high. I would prefer it to be under half, so like 24, 25. But it is what it is. You're a little bit crazy, and that's why I love you.
Yeah, same. And it's evidenced by your opinion on this movie. So before we get back to that movie, once again, I want to say, Film and Whiskey Nation, if you're going to the liquor store and you see that they have these little, 50 milliliter sized shots of Canadian Mist, please pick one up. Plop down the dollar and let us know what you think, because we really need a hashtag Team Bob or a hashtag Team Brad on this one. I have to know what the rest of the world thinks of Canadian Mist. Brad, would you recommend this whiskey?
No, Bob, I would not.
And you know what? I would. I think it's worth the $10 investment. I think it's definitely worth the $1 investment just to try it. Even if you come out with a score as low as Brad's, you get a good story out of it. So,
I mean, I will say I scored this, I think, higher than Basil Hayden's.
And again, that's the value score coming into things. Basil Hayden's, I don't think, is any better than this whiskey, and it costs 4 times as much for a fifth. So there you go.
Yeah, you're welcome, Film and Whiskey Nation.
All right, Brad, what do you say we get back into talking about the Iron Giant?
Let's get to it.
All right, so that was Canadian Mist, the best whiskey of all time, according to both me and Brad.
Bob, you are a liar. Like the government, the dirty old government.
In this film, that's right. And Brad, actually, I think that's a great segue, because we need to start talking about what it is that you disliked about this movie, because I'm really struggling to find anything in this movie that I would point out as a serious flaw. I don't think that it's a perfect movie, but it's darn near flawless to me. So I'd love to hear from your point of view, as a person who's only seen it once, what was it about the Iron Giant that just didn't do it for you?
Yeah, so for me, I will say that I do fall a little bit more on the conservative end of the political spectrum. And so for me, watching this movie, you do see such a strong anti-government bias of so the movie's set in 1957, it's maybe not the height of the Cold War that you might have in the 60s and 70s, the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that. But it's the early stages of this Cold War, and the American government is extremely fearful of what's going on in Soviet Russia. In their mind, the Russians think differently than we do, and they're out for global conquest. There's all this fear going around, and I just feel like the political commentary from Bird on the American government of the 50s was just really unfair. Like, when you study the Cold War, when you study World War II, and you look at what was going on at that time, I don't think that they were unjustified at all in how afraid they were of a nuclear holocaust. Like, I think that was a very real thing. We had just gone from technology where, we could drop mortar shells and shoot rockets out of tanks and so on and so forth, and kill maybe, 20, 40, maybe 100 men at a time, to having a nuclear bomb that with its initial impact could kill tens to maybe 100,000 people, and its nuclear fallout could kill millions of people over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Like, I think that with such a surge in destructive technology, I don't think that the American government was wrong for being as afraid of Russia as they were. And I think that this political commentary on an American super government that's just, jumping at every shadow, I think that's pretty unfair to pose them in such a manner, especially when the movie itself. So I guess that's my commentary on how he treats the actual real American government of the 50s. But then even within the movie, it sends this mixed message of like, well, the government shouldn't be scared of the Iron Giant because he's nice and he's kind and he takes care of Hogarth. But we see the Iron Giant turn into this massive War of the Worlds style death robot that's just destroying a town, destroying the army. And so I kind of look at that and I go, well, maybe the American government in this movie was right to want to destroy this robot. It's literally a death machine that might be calling more death machines to Earth to destroy it. So I just feel like the movie is sending a weird mixed message, and it makes me struggle with liking this movie.
Ever hear of Sputnik?
Yeah, it's the first satellite in space.
Foreign satellite, Hogarth, and all that implies. Even now, it orbits overhead. Boop, boop, watching us. We can't see it, but it's there. Much like that giant thing in the woods. We don't know what it is or what it can do. I don't feel safe, Hogarth. Do you?
What are you talking about?
What am I talking about? What am I talking about? I'm talking about your gold-armed security, Hogarth! While you're snoozing in your wooded jammies back in Washington, we're wide awake and worried. Why? Because everyone wants what we have, Hogarth. Everyone. You think this middleman is fun, but who built it? The Russians, the Chinese, Martians, Canadians? I don't care! All I know is we didn't build it, and that's reason enough to assume the worst and blow it to kingdom come. Now, you are going to tell me about this thing, you are going to lead me to it, and we are going to destroy it before it destroys us!
I think what's interesting about it being set in the 50s during the Red Scare, which is a time when Joseph McCarthy was saying, you're a communist, you're a communist, you're a communist, without a lot of suspicion, ruining people's lives, there is a commentary about the human capacity for suspicion. And I think Kent Mansley really brings that out. I think he talks a lot about like, well, we didn't build it, so we know it's evil, so we got to destroy it. And what I love about when I watched it this time around is Kent Mansley is contrasted from the Iron Giant, who kind of, yes, like has the capacity for great death and destruction, but it's kind of like this pure, loving thing. There's no room in his heart for change. There's no room in his heart for like tolerance or openness. And I just thought that was really interesting to see. Especially, I was really influenced when I was reading some work on it, and Brad Bird said one of the premise for the film is, what would it be like if a gun didn't want to be a gun anymore? If it had a soul and it didn't want to be a gun anymore. And I really saw that conflict play out really well, and how the giant was working through his own stuff, which seems kind of silly to say when it's a robot who could barely speak. But I think it portrayed a lot of emotion and self-awareness and like searching. And in the end, makes like this beautiful ultimate sacrifice that even Kent Mansley wasn't willing to make, when he says like, well, screw the government or screw America. Like, I'm getting out of here. But the giant, being kind of like this barely, what seems to be something that's barely alive, decides to sacrifice himself. I thought it was a really cool take on what should be in our hearts. Like when our hearts are open to love, when our hearts are open to change, and when our hearts are open to see people in a different light.
Yeah, and going off that, I'm kind of surprised, Brad, that you saw the portrayal of the government the way you did, because I think, at least for me, I kind of made a distinction between the portrayal of Kent Mansley, a selfish, arrogant, ambitious, cutthroat kind of guy who isn't thinking through his actions, and the portrayal of the military especially. I thought that the general, he had a healthy sense of skepticism about what Mansley was doing. He was clearly thinking more logically than anybody else was. He decided to stand down when he was convinced by Dean that the creature only reacted violently in self-defense. And I think, this is not an overly complicated movie. I think that it's pretty clear that the Cold War sort of setting of the movie, it's providing a commentary on a lot of things. And the Iron Giant kind of represents the threat of Russia in a way, or any sort of enemy country, if you think about it that way. Like you said, Brad, it's clearly been designed to destroy. And so if you're looking at the differences between communism and capitalism or democracy, like, I think that what the movie is trying to show us is that even something that's designed to destroy something else can make a decision, can make an appeal to something deeper, something more human. And I think the Iron Giant, being this alien creature, comes into all these people's lives, these people who are concerned about what's Russia going to do to us? Are we going to be able to survive a nuclear bomb? Things like that. And he actually teaches these people how to be more human. He learns what it means to say no, even to the thing that he's designed to do, which is to destroy. And like Jordan was saying, I think Brad Bird's purpose in making this film was to explore the idea of what if something that was designed to destroy had a soul and decided it didn't want to destroy things anymore. And I think it's actually a really beautiful message, because it's not only teaching us as people who live in a specific country on Earth to not necessarily be as afraid of other things, but it also appeals to ourselves and to, the people that we consider our enemies, that there is something deeper than that. There's something more human. There is a way of love and sacrifice where you lay down your own priorities for the betterment of others.
Giant?
Oh, God. You stay. I go. No following.
I love you.
Like I said, it's not a really complicated message, but Hogarth's repeated kind of mantra of "you are what you choose to be," I think that says a lot. And it's portrayed really well by those two competing comic book characters that Hogarth introduces the Giant to, of Superman and Atomo. The Giant looks like Atomo. It's very clear that it is in his nature to be more like Atomo than to be like Superman. But he makes the decision to go against what his nature is for the betterment of himself and for others. And so I didn't see this so much as a critique of the government as much as I saw it as a critique of our kind of tendency as human beings to want to destroy something before we understand it, and to want to act, in a violent and destructive way, even if we're kind of perpetuating the cycle of violence instead of deciding to end it.
Yeah, I don't think that you're wrong in those in that analysis. I think that there is a lot of beauty in the way the Iron Giant kind of changes his nature and chooses to live into the Superman, style of life, of caring for others, of being self-sacrificial. I guess it's still just, I don't know, it just didn't hit home for me in that way. And in the first viewing of this movie, just kind of coming into it with some knowledge of what happens, it seemed to me like the big message did feel like that, the government is just bad. And I do agree that the military is portrayed differently with a sort of honor to them. But I don't know. It just didn't hit the right tone for me, really in the final half of the movie, in a way that I didn't think it would.
All right, so I think it's time for us to give this movie our final scores. Jordan, I'd love to hear from you first. What kind of a score would you give this film?
Yeah, I tried not to be emotional about it, but I did watch that final scene again with tears in my eyes, asking myself if I'd be willing to make the same kind of sacrifice that the Iron Giant would make for those he loved. And so I'd give this movie a solid 8 out of 10. It's just one of my favorite movies of all time. Just really happy to have been able to watch it again.
I'm very curious, Jordan. You say that this is your favorite movie of all time, and you give it one of your favorite movies of all time, and you give it an 8 out of 10. What would it take for a movie to get a 10 out of 10 for you?
There have been forms of media that I feel like have truly, in the long run, changed my life. And those movies, I think, in the long run would be a 10 out of 10. This movie is a special film, and I love its themes, but it's I think it would be difficult for me to give much of anything a 10 out of 10, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair observation. For me, this movie, it's solid. It's decent. It's interesting. It has good characters. I think the voice acting is well done. I think that Brad Bird's direction is really great with the cinematography. It was just kind of the overall theme and message of the movie that I struggled to, I don't know, kind of coalesce with, to really believe in. And so for me, I'm going to give it a 6.5 out of 10. I think it was solid overall. It's just not my favorite animated film.
Yeah, I've been struggling with this because, like I said, this is one of my favorite movies, probably of all time. I really love this movie. I'm just going to be honest with you. I've been struggling between giving it a 9.5 and a 10 because I really do think it's that good. For me, it's kind of coming down to the quickness of the movie and how quickly it gets you in and out. Because I think that this movie has all of the ingredients to be a perfect film. Like everything I want in a movie is there in this movie. It's almost like if you were going to make the perfect cake, but you didn't quite let it bake long enough. Like there's just a few moments where I feel like this movie is rushed, and it could have used even just a few seconds more to really hammer home some of its emotional points. I really want to give this movie a 10 because I think, to me, it's so important to me and it means so much to me and I love it so much that I want to give it a 10. But objectively, I think that it's probably a 9.5. And so I'm going to be the objective person here, and I'm going to say I'm going to give this movie a 9.5, which means that Brad and I are coming out to an average of an 8 out of 10 on this movie.
Actually, Bob, I do know what would have made me give this movie a 10 out of 10.
What's that?
I discovered that it was produced in part by Pete Townsend of The Who, and that he wanted to turn it into a musical. And I don't know what it would have been like for Vin Diesel to sing as the Iron Giant, but I assume that whatever that would have been, I would have given it a 10 out of 10 for sure.
Yeah, a musical version of Vin Diesel would have been spectacular. But yeah, I mean, I can see anybody giving this movie an 8 out of 10. It's solid. It's interesting. It's fun. It just didn't resonate with me quite as deeply. And honestly, I probably would have resonated more deeply with this movie at the age of 9 when it came out, or 12 or 15 or even 18 or 19. But I don't know, maybe I'm just a curmudgeonly old 29-year-old that didn't quite jive with it. Who's to say?
Well, we want to know what you think. So if you like The Iron Giant, or if you're more like Brad and you're kind of cooler on it, please get on social media and let us know what you think. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Film Whiskey.
Or you can give us a phone call. Our phone number is 216-800-5923. Let your voice be heard. Our phone number is 216-800-5923.
Next week, we'll be back talking about the 2011 sports classic, Warrior. For the Film and Whiskey podcast, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And I'm Jordan McCain.
And we'll see you next time.